Road to Boston Day 9 is here, and today we're going to be talking about the taper for your Boston Marathon race. So in the last video we talked about peak week, so the next logical thing that you're going to be doing is tapering for your Boston Marathon. The reason why you do a taper is to make sure that all of the hard work that you've done, in particular in that peak week that you just came out of, that you're able to use all that on race day, not have extra fatigue, anything like that as you're getting to your Boston Marathon on race day. So in the last video, we did talk about timing your peak week with the longest long run about 21 days before your race. That works for pretty much any marathon that you're getting ready for, but we didn't mention the reason why that's the case. And the reason is humans adapt in a pretty regular way to anything that's new. That could be a training stimulus, that could be a new habit that you're trying to form, and that's typically about 21 days for most people. That's why if you've heard that old adage about it takes 21 days to form a habit, it actually is pretty true. The actual recommendation is anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks for full adaptation to anything new. So 21 days is kind of right in the middle for that, and that's why it can fluctuate a little bit. So for this, your taper strategy, you're going to be doing this in that time frame for this very reason. So for a full marathon, I typically say about 2.5 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, depending on how you're feeling coming out of your peak week. For shorter races, the taper is going to be a little bit shorter for obvious reasons. But that's the general idea behind it, why we look at this in terms of the taper, why it actually works. So a couple key things that you're going to want to make sure that you're doing. You're going to be reducing volume in this time frame, and that's all volume, but you're not cutting out all intensity. There are these new trendy things that you see. I've even seen people talking about not running 10 days before your marathon. I think that's insane. That doesn't make any sense. There's a more systematic, logical way that you can do this, and from everything that I've seen from the coaching trainings I've gone to, through the different studies that I've seen on all of this, the best recommendation for your best taper is going to be to cut volume down, general mileage, but you're still leaving intensity in it. There's one exception for a type of training that would probably start to really greatly reduce, almost completely eliminate. But for the most part, if you cut out all of your intensity 21 days before your race, you're going to be flat on race day. Your body has different enzymes that it needs for different energy delivery, and that's one of the reasons why you need to hit things like even your anaerobic system at this time of year, specifically for marathon training. Anything above, like lactic threshold, or even in that marathon pace, you're going to be getting some anaerobic stimulation. So you need all of these things to still be happening on race day. You just spent a whole season building them. You don't want these general systems, way you're delivering energy, any of these things to be completely gone that you've built the whole year. So what could that look like for people? Well, typically anywhere from like a 20 to 25% reduction in your miles from your peak week in that, that 2.5 week out time frame, essentially. So if you're someone that's been doing, like, say, 3-hour long runs, 2:45, something like that in terms of total time for your long runs, because I like doing everything based on time, that might look like 2 hours, 2:10 for that long run. You're still doing things like, say, maybe even doing 30-minute marathon pace efforts. Maybe that looks like 30 to 25 minutes. So you're cutting some of it, but you're still going to have a lot of that in your actual training. You might be someone that's doing things like critical velocity toward the end, maybe something you're adding in these last, say, 6 weeks to get sort of that finish. If you're more of an experienced marathon runner, critical velocity is right around 10K pace for different interval sessions. Maybe you were doing things like, say, 4 by mile at critical velocity, just as an example. Maybe you're going to cut that to 3 by mile. Maybe you're going to, instead of doing 4 by mile, maybe you're going to do a slightly longer rep, like, say, 2Ks, and you're going to do 2 to 3 of those, something like that. You're still getting all of that intensity you've been doing, you're just reducing the amount of volume, so you're allowing fatigue to fall off. That's really why the taper works. So we talked about full adaptation takes about 2 to 4 weeks, so you're not getting full adaptation for anything you're doing during the taper. What is happening is the fatigue from the season is falling off. You're dropping off all that fatigue, and typically you can experience something like 2 to 4, maybe even as great as 6% of a performance gains, and it's not because of additional fitness gains, but you're gonna have some of that. It's just not gonna be full adaptation from these workouts, but it's the fatigue of the season falling off. So that's why you're reducing it. Now, some people might say, well, I'm going to lose a lot of this fitness during this time frame. But again, it takes 2 to 4 weeks to, fully adapt to anything, including less training. So I'm assuming most people that are going into Boston, this is kind of like one of your highlights. It's one you've been really building toward because it is such a prestigious race. So a full taper, 2.5 to 3 weeks, depending on your situation. And the more you do it, the more you realize how your body responds to it. But that's really why it's going to work for you in this situation. If you reduce that mileage and keep the intensity there, but you're also reducing that intensity. Now, one training type that I would really greatly reduce, if not completely get rid of, is fast hill training. You typically build that in early in your training. I talk about things like fast uphill and downhill. You're probably not doing very much marathon pace hills, or if you're doing very, very little of it. And that's because hills do add a lot of extra fatigue, and a lot of the training adaptation is the strength from it, and that takes a long time to build. So that might be something that you're totally getting rid of. You might still be doing some rolling hills. I talk about easy pace recovery runs on hills. You're still probably adding that, but nothing super fast and quick in terms of the hills because of the long timetable that it takes to really adapt to that. But also they're a little bit more dangerous too, especially if you're doing downhill reps. So hopefully you've done a lot of that work already and you're cutting that out. Don't panic train in the taper. If you feel like, oh, I don't have enough, you've got your fitness at this point. You can't manufacture anything that hasn't already been built. Basically, the adage that I really like to use with all of my athletes when it comes to this is the whole season, including the actual race, is like making a loaf of bread. And the end of the season is that piece of bread comes out and you see the way that it actually, turned out. That is your actual race. But, basically in a season, and if you've ever made bread, there's a lot of hard work that happens before. You have to do a lot of patient work, kneading, letting it rise, a lot of hard work at the beginning. The taper is like that piece of that the loaf of bread is in the oven. You can only mess it up by trying to do too much, like opening the oven too often, messing around with it or anything like that. You have to kind of like let things be where they are because you've done all that work before. That's really what the taper is. Just enough to maintain all of that fitness that you've done. You're not really going to gain very much, if any, and allowing that fatigue to fall off. So I mentioned about 25% reduction in that week, that 21 days or right after your peak week, so maybe 3 weeks out. Again, you're probably starting it about halfway through it. You might be doing for the entirety of it. It's very different for different situations. And then, the full 2 weeks before, maybe that's going to be like 30%, 40%, something like that. And then in that week of the race, really, it's most of the miles in the race are coming from the race itself. 26.2, you're dropping this to less than half of your total mileage, most likely. You're probably getting most of your miles for the week during the race in that last week, essentially. So keep all of those things in mind. You don't want to do too much. The taper definitely is a little bit stressful because people want to make sure that they are doing enough. The more you do these things with yourself, the more that you kind of realize how your body responds to things. The longer I work with athletes, the better I see how they respond to different types of tapers, different things that you're adding in, the amount, that kind of thing. But really, you just kind of like make sure that you're allowing all that fatigue and the stress to fall off from the entirety of the season. If you have any questions specifically about what your taper might look like, please ask those in the comments down below, or you can also schedule a strategy session with us and I will sit down with you personally and take a look at some of these things for you, maybe identify training gaps. But yeah, basically this is the end in terms of different types of training. We're going to be talking about mostly logistics, where you can do shakeout runs, carb loading, things like that, as we get into these last few videos for this road to Boston. But again, if you do have any questions about your taper, because I know it can be a little bit stressful to do less at this time of year, please ask those in the comments and I'd be happy to help.